May the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. As I mentioned earlier, I work at Appleby College, and as well as being the chaplain that runs the services, I also teach world religions to a significant number of the grade 10 students that are at Appleby. Teaching Christianity is kind of interesting when we get to the unit on Christianity, because I think students kind of think they understand it until I give them kind of a different perspective. And one of the things that we talk about is we talk about festivals, including Advent and Christmas. And one of the things I explain is that while the secular world, when they talk about Christmas and are saying things like Merry Christmas at this time of year, we're actually not at Christmas yet. We are in the season of Advent. Fun fact, today being December 1st is one of the few days, about once every 5 years or so, where the start of Advent actually does start on December 1st. That's one of the things that I always need to kind of dispel, because actually, as you know, Advent will shift a little bit depending on what day Christmas lands on. So it leads to the question of, well, what is the Advent season about? And I think a great way to start is actually the Advent wreath itself. Because in the Advent wreath, we have those values that we uphold at this time, hope, peace, joy, and love. But there's a little story or parable associated with the Advent wreath that I think really sums up why we start with hope and why it's so important to start with hope. And the story goes like this. You can imagine the Advent wreath all lit with all the candles. And the love candle is looking around into the world and does not see love. And I think it's something that we can kind of relate to in our world nowadays. And the candle looks around, cannot find love anywhere, and eventually loses that hope, and the love candle extinguishes, and it gets a bit darker. And then the joy candle, without any joy in the world, without any love in the world, no longer sees or experiences joy. And it loses hope, and it extinguishes. And then with no joy and no love in the world, there is disharmony and discord and challenges of this regard, which leads for the peace candle to extinguish itself as well. But here's the thing about the hope candle, is the hope candle doesn't work in the present day. It works for what could be, what is possible out there. And so despite all the strife and all the hatred and all the anger and all the discord and whatever it is in the world, the hope candle says, I'm going to keep a light and keep this light going in the possibility of what can happen. And eventually the peace candle looks to the hope candle and says, oh, I get it now. I kind of see it now. I can see where peace is possible. And it reignites, and it gets a little brighter. Which leads to the joy candle, which starts to see the possibility of joy in the world, and it reignites, and it gets a bit brighter. And then the love candle, seeing the joy and the peace in the world, starts to understand that there's possibility for love in the world again, and it shines brighter. And then we culminate in lighting of the Christ candle. Now, it sounds all kind of wonderful, but we also recognize the world we live in. We just read about it, in the opening readings and in Bishop Susan's. There is lots of strife and a lot of challenges that we face. I myself am a bit of a pop culture junkie, and I like music. I always like a song. I always was a fan of Genesis. They had a song in 1987 which I think sums up kind of what it is called Land of Confusion. And these are the lyrics from their song they wrote almost 40 years ago now. I must have dreamed 1,000 dreams, been haunted by 1,000,000 screams, but I can hear the marching feet, they're moving into the street. Now, did you read the news today? They say the danger's gone away, but I can see the fires still alight. They're burning into the night. There's too many men, too many people, making too many problems, and there's not much love to go around. Can't you see this is the land of confusion? And it goes on about, and this is the world we live in, and things like that. And I think it really sums up, 40 years later, we are finding these same challenges in our world. And we're wondering what we can do with it. And at the same time, we're also challenged by understanding this idea of Advent, and a lot of the readings that we have today in today's first Sunday of Advent reading is this idea of a second coming of Jesus, right? Where all this stuff will go away. One of my favorite passages actually is the one we just read from Jeremiah that talks about the new covenant. Thessalonians and Luke's gospel talks about the second coming of Jesus in this kind of grandeur and splendor. And there's always this kind of debate of how is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? When will we know? Now, the first followers of Jesus in that first 100 years thought it was going to happen in their lifetime, and it never did. And we're still waiting, and we're still in the midst of this land of confusion, and we're still kind of struggling. What do we do? Well, I think that we have to rethink our understanding, first of all, what it means to talk about the second coming of Jesus in our lives. And this is why Advent is so important. Because I would argue that the second coming of Jesus is not so much about something that may or may not happen down the road, but the second coming of Jesus is something that we experience as Christians every single year when we go into the season of Advent. Because it carries us through, starting with hope, bringing peace and joy and love. And it carries us where? To a Christ child born in a manger to poor peasant parents who are internally displaced by a foreign occupation power. And in that, we have the new hope for a world, the Son of God, the Mashiach, the Messiah, the one that will bring us to salvation. And we forget how ingrained in our current reality that happens. That is not some fantasy thing down out there, but it's in the midst of our lives. And that is the true power of Advent, is to recognize that we are journeying with God to welcome God's Son, to welcome that Christ child, and to see a different world that is possible where justice and equity is at the center of what we do. And there's another part of this as well, because we're not just passive observers. We are actively participating in this journey, and we are actively participating in this world. There's another verse in the last verse of that song by Genesis goes like this. I won't be coming home tonight. My generation will put it right. We're not just making promises that we'll never keep. And then in the chorus, they kind of change the words around a bit, and they say, this is the world we live in, and these are the hands we're given. Stand up and let's show just what our lives are going to. Even in that song, in the midst of all the trauma and the pain in the song, there is a message of hope. So how do we do that? How do we live it out? Well, I was at a conference about 3 weeks ago in the United States for Episcopal schools, kind of the American equivalent of Anglican schools that I work at. And I heard from a gentleman by the name of Steve Pemberton. A remarkable story. And without getting too much into the details of his story, let's just say that he was in the foster care system, and literally on his notes in his file, it said, this kid has no hope. This kid is just going to continue a cycle of pain and trauma and drug addiction and violence and this kind of thing. But he didn't. He lived a very, very different life. And why? Well, it started with somebody he referred to as the book angel. Now, Steve Pemberton, as a young boy, was a voracious reader, but his foster parents wouldn't let him read. So he had to sneak out of the house, and he read whatever book he could get his hands on. And so often he'd read the same book over and over and over again. And there was a woman that used to walk along his street, and she saw him reading this book. Well, one day she stops and she says to this young boy, she says, I see you've been reading that book. Shouldn't you be finished by now? And he says, well, I love that book so much that I just want to start it. Sorry, fix that. I just want to start it from the beginning and read it again. And she went, Well, the next day, as he's in his room, he hears a knock at the door, and he peeks out the door. And sure enough, this book angel comes with a box of books. And for the next 10 years, every month, she dropped off a box of books for him to read. Now, he goes on to talk about two other people in his lives that changed the trajectory of his life. And he refers to them as lighthouses. And he talks a lot about lighthouses. And there's that image again. Light in the darkness, guiding our way. Now, 35 years later, he wrote a book about his life, and they made it into a movie. And sure enough, this woman, through the book and the movie, he was actually able to find out who this woman was. And so 35 years later, he gets to meet this woman, and he asks her, he says, "Why did you drop off those books?" And she said, "Because I could tell that you love to read, but you didn't really have the opportunity. And I've been taught in my life to give from where I am. And I have 3 children of my own. They were a bit older than you, and they would outgrow their books. So every time they outgrew the books, I would bring them to your house." You see, each and every one of us can be a lighthouse or live out the light that we find in the hope and the peace and the joy and the love, and be part of the ongoing journey with God to be a different way of being in the world, and carrying us to that moment where we do welcome Christ in our lives again as that child born in a manger that disrupts everything about what we think about what power looks like, and says that power comes from kindness and compassion and equity and justice, and living out these principles of our Advent season. So as we start our journey here, let us be reminded of the new covenant that God promises us, no matter how hard things are, that Christ will come and will return, maybe not in the way we expect it to be, but is also inviting us along on that journey to bring about God's kingdom of peace, love, and justice into our world. Amen.